Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda, and I'm a student at Fort Hays State University in the graduate level developmental psychology course. And I'm going to present the topic of temper tantrums. The purpose of this presentation is to address the relationship between what is typically normally developing behavior and what may be cause for concern. I will incorporate theories from Erickson's psychosocial theory, information processing theory, and also attachment theory into the presentation, as well as school psychology implications. According to this article, tantrums are a worldwide normative behavior in young children who still need to learn self control. Tantrum behaviors can also be expressed in many ways, with the most common being the ones listed above. It is concerning, however, if the child exhibits aggressive physical behavior with a long duration of more than 15 minutes or frequent occurrences with more than 3 per week. Temper tantrums are a common behavioral difficulty in children, and although they are considered a normal part of development, certain characteristics may be cause for concern, such as longer tantrums or a severity of a tantrum. If that's the case, then those type of tantrums have been linked to psychological issues by both children as well as their caregivers. This particular study was a cross-sectional descriptive study done in 2021. The main caregivers of the children were given a questionnaire that collected their demographic information, the characteristics of the tantrums, and the effects that they took on the caregivers' emotions. Data from 211 kids were included in the study, and the mean age of the kids was 4.4 years old. 201 parents, which was a staggering 95.3%, reported that their children had at least one tantrum behavior, of which verbal outbursts were the most common. 111 children, which was 55.2%, had tantrums defined as problematic, with more aggressive behaviors and tantrums that lasted a lot longer. This may come as no surprise to you that it also impacted the caregiver's emotions, and therefore, children with problematic temper tantrums should receive assistance. Although Erickson has 8 stages of psychosocial development, we're focusing on the early childhood and preschool stages because tantrums are just way more prevalent in these stages. The autonomy versus shame and doubt stage is closely linked to temper tantrums. Children are becoming more independent during this stage and often want to choose their own clothing, their own food, their own toys for themselves instead of having somebody choosing it for them. But if adults are over controlling or negative, this could be cause for an outburst. Also, parents and caregivers, when they set limits, this can be cause for tantrums to occur also. They get frustrated and act out. And it's their way of expressing what they're feeling um, while also learning autonomy. In the initiative versus guilt stage, which are ages 3 to 6, tantrums may still happen, but are less likely to with language progression. Also, their problem solving skills improve during this stage. Children start taking initiative a lot during this stage and acting out their own ideas. But if they feel ignored or punished too harshly, they may express themselves with strong emotions, sometimes tantrums. School psychologists would recommend that caregivers guide rather than shame, as this is more likely to help them with self control and responsibility. And according to Erickson, developmentally normal reactions to challenges and achieving autonomy and initiative happen. Tantrums are not just bad behavior, but it's part of working through crises of independence versus control. And if teachers, caregivers, and parents want more effective resolutions, then they need to provide safe, structured environments with patience and reassurance. And we want to do this because it teaches acceptability and ways of handling frustrating situations. And school psychs would probably also want caregivers to consider keeping a consistent routine, with added flexibility considering their age. And we use Erickson's stage as a guide to introduce social emotional learning. And some of these learning strategies that we could teach are calming strategies and also emotion naming and self regulation strategies. According to this particular article from the Journal of Psychology and Psychiatry, temper modulation issues are a hallmark sign of a common mental health concern. So they characterize specific signs of temper loss from normative behaviors to clinically significant issues. This is an important step towards identifying clinical threshold across socio-demographical groups. And across those subgroups that were tested for this study, nearly 87% of preschoolers had tantrums at some point, but only 8.6 had daily tantrums. Normative misbehaviors happen more frequently than clinically concerning ones, which is a relief. Milder behaviors usually reflected frustration, whereas clinically concerning problems were indicators of unpredictable or the problematic temper tantrums that were more severe. They indicated like unpredictability. They were prolonged and destructive. Therefore, temper loss was associated with emotional and behavioral problems. Um, Washclog and colleagues stress that early childhood is an important period for testing temper loss. And this is because of the sometimes concerning degree of overlap between, okay, what's normative and what's not as far as temper tantrums go. As school psychologists, we would want to use observation techniques, perhaps the ABC method, where A stands for antecedent, which is the trigger that causes the behavior to occur. B for behavior, so observing the behavior itself, and C for consequence. What happens after the tantrum? Like, what are the reactions from others? Sometimes that's a consequence. How do these affect or reinforce the tantrums? In this next slide, we'll discuss what it means for tantrums to be disruptive versus normative. In early childhood, temper loss, aggression, and noncompliance are very common. Anyone who has kids or who has worked with kids, especially early childhood, you know this. But according to Briggs, Gowan, and Washlag from the Institute of Juvenile Research Department of Psychiatry in the University of Illinois, Chicago, 75% of children will show aggression and tantrums by age 2. And these are considered normative behaviors. The fact that noncompliance, temper loss, and aggression also represent core features of disruptive behavior disorders, which I labeled DBD, has made the validation of DBDs in preschool children especially challenging. In response to this issue, they used the Disruptive Behavioral Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is I labeled DBDOS, to examine whether the observed quality and behavior distinguishes preschoolers with clinically concerning disruptive behavior from typically developing preschoolers, and also observed pattern of more noticeable behaviors predicts impairments above and beyond maternal report of behavior frequency. They did this first by classifying children as preschoolers with clinically concerning disruptive behavior from typically developing preschoolers. And they also observed patterns of prominent behavior and how it predicted impairment above and beyond maternal report of behavioral frequency. They also agree that DBD symptoms have a massive overlap with normative behaviors, such as losing temper, ignoring adult requests, and initiating rough play. They stated that a historical issue is that initial research on preschoolers psychopathology has required hypothesis testing in the absence of tools designed to do so. Thus, diagnostic interviews specifically developed for the preschool age are of substantial advance. Parent interviews have traditionally been the cornerstone of research on child psychopathology. because they provide essential information about the history of behavior. Also, the critical features necessary for distinguishing normative behavior from disruptive behavior in preschoolers are the quality of behavior and its outcomes across contexts. Please, please note that we have defined quality of behavior as the extent to which behavior is modulated and expected. It was concluded that mild aggression is developmentally appropriate. And this is in the context of like peer disputes, mild aggression, maybe rough and tough tumble play. But in contrast, aggressive behaviors directed towards an adult are not developmentally normal. And that was what was seen um, in the study. Although the importance of direct observation for assessment of children is widely recognized, it has been difficult to demonstrate the clinical application of direct observation in the absence of standardized methods. This article dealt with temper tantrums in healthy versus depressed and disruptive preschoolers and defined tantrum behaviors associated with clinical problems. The purpose of this study was to investigate whether differences in tantrum behaviors of healthy versus mood and disruptive disorders could be detected. 279 preschoolers ages 3 to 6 completed the preschool age psychiatric assessment, which was used to determine preschoolers' diagnostic classification and to measure behaviors. Preschoolers were placed in 1 and 4 diagnostic groups: healthy, depressed, disruptive, and comorbidly depressed / disruptive on the basis of the DSM-4. It was found that disruptive preschoolers displayed violence during tantrums significantly more than the depressed or healthy groups. The disruptive group had significantly more tantrums at school and daycare than the depressed and healthy groups had. The disruptive group had a more difficult time recovering from tantrums than the healthy preschoolers did. In addition, depressed preschoolers were more aggressive towards objects and other people than healthy children. Finally, the depressed preschoolers displayed more self-harm tantrums than preschoolers in the healthy or the disruptive groups. These findings provide guidelines to parents, teachers, and practitioners in identifying tantrum behaviors that may indicate a psychiatric disorder. And if that were the case, that would require a mental health referral. It's important for school psychs to understand the function of a temper tantrum, and the social learning theory is helpful with that because we can recognize that sometimes misbehaviors are just a way of trying to communicate or get attention sometimes from teachers or peers. I know that happens often when a child is trying to get out of doing a task. And this will help when a school psychologist has to do testing to help identify why tantrums sometimes keep happening. Modeling and parent training could help guide teachers and parents in the right direction to help model calm behaviors. This reinforcement that we use in the social learning theory prioritizes positive reinforcement and praise, as well as giving appropriate strategies. It is well known that temper tantrums are commonly challenging behaviors in kids with autism, but is there a comparison whether or not autistic kids have more tantrums than normally developing kids? According to Bucamp and colleagues, while autistic tantrums during preschool are common, it is unknown whether they are qualitatively or quantitatively different from those arising in other neurodevelopmental conditions. The results showed that kids with autism had more frequent tantrums with no identifying triggers and a higher proportion of tantrums triggered by communication problems in the context of demands. And their parents were also more likely to give in to their demands in response to the tantrums. No other group differences in terms of frequency, duration, triggers, modulators, and behaviors were found. The conclusion was that they did not find an increased frequency of tantrums in kids with and without autism, although speech language barriers did correlate with increased frustrations in the ASD group. They also stated that further research should now consider if autistic tantrums themselves differ from that of typically developing peers. Here's another article on autism. This article was similar to the last about temper tantrums and some of the findings, but it specifically tests whether communication problems and tantrums are common in children with autism. It has long been thought that lack of speech is a cause for tantrums in autistic kids. The goal of this study was to determine if impaired speech is in fact associated with tantrums of preschool children with autism. In this test, kids were given IQ tests along with language tests, and mothers rated tantrum frequency and speech on a 4-point scale on the pediatric behavioral scale. Verbal and nonverbal IQ, expressive and receptive language were tested, language quotients, age equivalence, and speech intelligibility showed that less than 3% of the variance in tantrum frequency. Children whose mental age was sufficient for verbal communication but who lacked speech did not have more tantrums than children with adequate speech. In fact, children with expressive language at or above 24 months had more tantrums than children whose speech skills were below 24 months, which is very surprising, I think. I think looking at kids with autism, I know that people automatically just assume that they have more behavioral issues, including temper tantrums. So this is a relief, and I hope perhaps some assurance for parents or teachers that they found these findings, because oftentimes kids do have problems with speech and language. So, but in the other study too, I think it was the context of demands and not the speech itself. Children who struggle with temper tantrums have limits in their ability to process information. Young children have limited working memory, attention spans, and processing speeds. When too much information comes into play, they are just on system overload, and temper tantrums are likely to occur. This, in part, is due to the role of self-regulation and emotional incapacity since they're still learning to identify their emotions. Sometimes school psychologists may break down directions for them into smaller, simpler steps in order to help with that system overload. And I know that in the schools, they'll sometimes use supports like pictures or charts, and these can help with transitions. Like, okay, we're going here next, here, and that just helps with all the demands and everything they have to do. That may help temper tantrums. According to attachment theory, a child's bond with their parents shape emotional regulation, coping strategies, and social development. Temper tantrums can be understood as attachment-driven behaviors, which is a child's way of signaling distress or unmet needs or insecurity. It is also important for parents and caregivers to have secure attachments with their children so that trust is learned. Consistency and sensitivity are also key factors to keep in mind. When children have a tantrum, it's often just a temporary expression of frustration, but with a healthy attachment style, they will be better able to express emotions because they learn that comfort and problem solving will follow. If children don't receive this, they may develop an insecure, avoidant attachment where they may seem cold and disconnected. Um, with an insecure, ambivalent resistance attachment to parents, children experience a wide array of inconsistency. Sometimes parents respond to their needs appropriately, sometimes not. And they're used to this inconsistency. And this is not good when discussing temper tantrums because they cause the tantrums to escalate. Disorganized attachment is linked to chaotic or neglectful parenting or caregiving. In this case, the tantrums are extreme for kids. They're unpredictable, and children in these cases, they lack a reliable strategy for comfort. School psychologists will need to remember the attachment styles in developmental psychology in order to serve their students. Also remember what works for one kid will not work for another. They're all different. Um, for example, a securely attached kid would only need gentle reminders and reassurance, where an ambivalent or disorganized children will vary in their structured environments. They're going to need a lot more consistency, a lot more structure. Please keep this in mind when becoming a school psychologist. Also, to teach other staff members who may see tantrums as just, oh, he's a bad kid, he's bad, he has bad behavior. Let's not look at them like that. Let's teach that they are just trying to get their needs met and be taken care of. And I just want to thank everybody for listening to my presentation about temper tantrums. And I hope that I've shed some light on the behaviors of children who may express them. I want to wish you all the best of luck, and I hope you have a great rest of the semester. Bye.